Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking some time to view my presentation on managing procrastination. My name is Betty Sims, and I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I serve as a retention specialist and coordinator for academic programs here at the AAC. I also identify as someone who has spent my fair share of time procrastinating. So I was really interested in putting together this presentation, and I hope you'll learn some helpful information, just as I did while I was doing research for this. So today we're going to be covering three main topics. First, we're going to define procrastination before moving on to discuss a few different ways to manage it. We'll then wrap up with some next steps. So if you have viewed my other presentation on this YouTube channel on understanding procrastination, you'll know by now that procrastination is a very, very common experience. Almost everyone experiences it at some point in their life, although different folks experience it to different extents. Because it's such a common experience, typically folks might not be able to define it, but we're all pretty familiar with that procrastination feeling. Procrastination can be defined as the voluntary, irrational delay in action despite the expectation of a potential negative outcome. According to some of my research, some common emotions experienced by folks who have recently procrastinated are stress, worry, and feelings of guilt. So, when we procrastinate, there are two things going on internally: the desire to complete the task and the resistance. Take a minute and reflect on a time when you've procrastinated. What was happening? What were you doing? And what were you avoiding? Take a minute to be as specific as possible. When you think of this time, are you able to identify how you were feeling? Some things that typically come up for folks can include maybe feelings of being overwhelmed, maybe there's just too much to do and I've lost all motivation, disengagement, perhaps. Something else that can come up for folks is a feeling of perfectionism. Maybe folks want to do things in a specific way, time, or process, and have a hard time getting started if things don't align perfectly. Lastly, anxiousness can come up as well. This can look like negative self talk, such as thinking things around, I can't do this. What if can also come up through anxiety. And that can also lead to demotivation, disengagement, and procrastination. So, when we think of procrastination, it's really important to consider the following. First, procrastination is not a matter of laziness or personal failing. That being said, it is something that can have a real negative impact on our lives. And when we try to make a change to the ways in which we procrastinate, practice is really important. There's no one specific strategy that might eliminate our tendency to procrastinate. It's really going to be a practice of trial and error, as well as time to build a new habit. Throughout this presentation, I'll be discussing a couple different methods for managing and reducing procrastination. I'd really encourage you to choose one of the methods that we discuss and really try it for 1 week. Choosing one method can help us on the road to better managing procrastination. The first technique I'd like to discuss is mindfulness. As I shared earlier, when we procrastinate, there's really two things going on internally: the desire to complete the task and the resistance. This can also look like a desire to do a task and a stronger desire to do something else. So, for example, knowing that we need to write an essay, but cleaning the kitchen instead. In the PowerPoint in front of you, you can see a diagram that I've mapped out to The diagram on this page really maps out one method of engaging mindfully with our tendency to procrastinate. It begins by noticing, moving into questioning, then listening, and then finally letting that awareness lead. One metaphor that might be helpful in helping folks conceptualize what this actually means is the idea of sitting at a dinner table. I think many of us have had this experience where our families have gathered at a dinner table and a debate emerges. Different family members may pitch in different perspectives, sometimes even talking over one another. We may jump into the discussion and add to the conversation, but sometimes we can also remain quiet and listen to the different perspectives. So imagine that your emotions are represented by different family members at the table. On one side, you may have the emotion or part of you that wants to procrastinate. On the other side, you may have the emotion or part of you that wants to complete the task. Your responsibility is to listen to each parts of yourself at the table as closely as possible. What are they saying? For example, the part of us that wants to complete the task may cite how stressed you were the last time you procrastinated, or some other perceived negative consequences. The part of you that wants to procrastinate may cite exhaustion or feelings of being overwhelmed. The trick here is to listen to all parts or all emotions without judgment or criticism. Acknowledge the different pieces and parts of yourself or the different emotions and accept those things as valid. Listening and acknowledge can often lead to greater clarity and increased emotional awareness. Let this awareness guide your decision making process moving forward. So, to recap, using the dinner table metaphor as well as this mindfulness graphic, we have first noticing our emotions, so noticing who is at the table. Second, questioning, so what is the intent? What are each parts of you saying? What are those emotions saying? We have listening to the different parts of yourself without criticism or judgment. And lastly, letting that sense of awareness guide your decision making going forward. Another really simple method to help Another really simple method to help getting tasks done is the Pomodoro technique. This technique is named after a Pomodoro or tomato kitchen timer. The essence of it involves considering in advance what the tasks you're going to complete might look like and what you might need to get done. In essence, this technique looks like setting a timer for a focused work time for about 25 minutes before engaging in a break time for about 5 minutes, and then repeating this cycle about 4 times. So 25 minutes of focused work followed by a 5 minute break is one Pomodoro. Some things to keep in mind are to protect your focus time from any and all distractions, and conversely, to protect your break time from any work. Another trick is to avoid tasks during your break time that tend to suck you in for long periods of time. I don't know about you, but I tend to get lost in those social media sites and spend way more time than I originally wanted. Instead, try to go for a walk or do some light stretching or listen briefly to a podcast. Another thing I really love about the Pomodoro method is that it can be flexible. If you need longer or shorter work times or longer or shorter break times, that's okay. It's about what helps you focus. The next tip I have is to create a detailed weekly to-do list. This is specifically helpful for the folks who tend to procrastinate because they feel overwhelmed. In order to use this technique, identify some time at the beginning of your week, so typically on a Sunday or a Monday, and really identify what you want your priority to be for the rest of the week. Be sure to include the task as well as the completion date, as well as a notes section. I mentioned this can really be helpful if you're feeling overwhelmed or that there are too many things to do that you're not quite sure where to prioritize. And lastly, when you are creating your weekly to-do list, it's incredibly important to be realistic. If you know that you're only going to be able to complete 1 or 2 tasks per day, let that be your daily limit. When we're able to complete the tasks that we've laid out for ourselves for the day, that can be very energizing and motivating. But the opposite can be true if we set ourselves up for success by identifying too many tasks to complete per day. Here are some additional tips to really help begin to manage procrastination. The first is to make it easy to get started. So, here it's also important to reflect on what's coming up for you that's preventing you from getting started. Is it feeling overwhelmed? If that's the case, maybe break up the task into smaller pieces. Is it feeling that this task will be really challenging and uninteresting? If so, tell yourself that you'll only focus on it for the next 5 minutes or so. Really, the key here is to identify and address any barriers that are keeping you from getting started. The next tip is to pair tasks that have delayed gratification with instant rewards. For example, we know that studying for an exam can lead to better grades, which can lead to graduation, which can lead to a job, which can lead to a better life. This can be really motivating in some contexts. However, when we're struggling with procrastination, thinking about the long term outcome of graduating or even for studying can be really difficult. Pairing something that rewards us in the long term with an instant reward can really help in this regard. This might look like rewarding yourself with your favorite meal after a night of studying, for example. The next tip is to imagine the future. But I don't mean imagine yourself 5 or 10 years down the line, or even 5 months down the line. I mean, imagine your future self when you're experiencing the consequences of procrastination. So, this might be you 1 week out from the exam, trying to get the motivation to study. Imagine what you'll feel and what you'll experience the night before the exam if you don't study at all. So essentially, we're trying to imagine the emotional and physical consequences that can come with procrastination. Similarly, you can also imagine how you might feel when you go into an exam feeling really prepared and ready, having studied all week. Next, we have the idea of reframing the task and the deadline. The next tip is to reframe the task and the deadline. Try to focus on some positive outcomes that might happen when you don't procrastinate. So, for example, maybe asking yourself the question of what would happen if I finish this essay on Thursday night so I have the weekend to myself? Next, we have the idea of using a timer. So, very similar to the Pomodoro method, where we set some time specifically to focus, followed by some time spent away from the task or focusing on something else. Lastly, we have the critical component of practicing self kindness. As I mentioned, procrastination is an incredibly common experience. Almost everyone experiences it to some extent. We also know that motivation is not constant. We can't constantly be in a place of performing at 100%. In those moments when we do procrastinate, it's important to be aware of any negative self talk that might be coming up and to recognize that ultimately, negative self talk does not help us to accomplish our goals. One technique I like to practice when I'm struggling with being kind to myself is to ask myself how I might talk with a friend who's coming to me with a very similar issue. Generally, I would not respond to a friend in the same way that I would respond to myself. I would be much kinder to my friend. And so, taking that same application of kindness and understanding and trying to apply that to myself. Another tip is to minimize the distractions that can break your concentration. I think we're all familiar with the times that we have really been in the flow, we're really working through some things, and then all of a sudden our concentration is switched to something else and we lose our groove. Minimizing distractions can look like finding a quiet place to study outside of our dorm. Next, if you find that you're really struggling to understand what's coming up for you, or if you find procrastination to be a chronic issue that is something that is impacting your life more than you would like it to, please know that counseling can also be a really great place both to start getting in touch with why you might be procrastinating, as well as to practice that self kindness that I was talking about. While I can be critical sometimes of the ways in which we use apps to try to help us with everything in our lives, there are actually some apps that can help minimize those distractions. Two examples of this are the Self Control app for Mac users and the Stay Focused app for PC users. These two apps specifically block websites for a set period of time. So, for example, I can say within the self control user interface that I would like to block Instagram for 2 hours. Once I turn on the app, I won't be able to access it from my computer. And I also, for that period of time, cannot access self control to turn off that function. And lastly, it's really difficult to be present and to be motivated when our basic needs are not being met. So please prioritize sleeping, eating, and taking care of yourself. So, for the next 7 days, I would like to invite you to choose one tip or method that we discussed today and really apply it to your life. At the end of those 7 days, I would also like to invite you to really set some time aside to reflect on if it worked. Did it help? If it did, great, continue to use it for the next 30 days. If it didn't work, what about it did not work? Is it possible to tweak that method so that it can work better for you? Or is there a different method that you would prefer to try? As I mentioned, procrastination is a very complex emotional experience. Therefore, it's going to take time and intentional practice to become more effective at managing it. Thank you all so much for taking some time to view this presentation. I hope it was helpful. Please note that I have another presentation on this YouTube channel that deals more with understanding procrastination. So if you have more questions, I would highly encourage you to watch that YouTube video. In addition, there are many YouTube videos out there that provide more information around mindfully engaging with procrastination, as well as other practical tips for managing it. Thanks again. Have a great day.